This CPU has a hole in it. But why? That can't be right. Right?
If you're sick of seeing that same Activate Windows watermark over and over, snag an OEM license from SCD Key. You'll have a fully activated OS in seconds, and you can kiss that watermark goodbye. And be sure to use menu offer code GSL for that sweet discount.
So if you have an old Intel Pentium chip laying around, or maybe something relatively new, like a Cascade Lake X 1090DXE for instance, you may have noticed the small hole, and it's literally visible. I mean, you can shove stuff inside of it. Thermal paste gets trapped in here all the frickin' time. But what purpose does it serve? I mean, obviously it's been used by Intel for generations, and while I couldn't find an instance where AMD's used one, I wouldn't be surprised if one existed. This hole is functional. It is not a defect, and its purpose is to allow heat and trace gases to vent without significant pressure buildups under load, while the epoxy that holds the IHS together cures. Got it? Video's not over though, we're gonna talk about why. Now, the IHS, or integrated heat spreader in Intel's case, is this solid block of metal here, consisting of copper and a nickel plating. This is typical of most cold plates on CPU coolers as well. Both metals have super high thermal conductivities, relatively speaking, and the idea is to pass heat through this barrier as efficiently as possible. Using something with a relatively low thermal conductivity, something like bismuth or lead would be pretty awful, would result in significantly higher core temperatures, and you'd need to either undervolt the chip or throttle back its frequency, or both, in order to account for this limitation. Now, the IHS is generally held to the CPU substrate. That's this big slab of green silicon right here with epoxy. It's a black gooey substance that adheres to or more surfaces, kind of like glue, but it doesn't always cure or harden overnight. Depending on its composition, it could take several days. And it's because of this that Intel includes a small hole in their larger chips. But where the heck does the pressure aspect of this explanation come into play? I mean, why would there be pressure inside of a CPU? Well, it isn't inside the CPU per se, rather a pocket of air exists between the IHS and substrate, and as core temps rise under load, so too will the temperature of this air. And since air behaves closely enough to an ideal gas at room conditions, we can use the ideal gas law to calculate the corresponding pressure increase. That's PV equals nRT. You may have seen this before, but in such a situation, pressure and temperature are proportional, meaning that if one goes up, the other will also go up. The volume remains fixed if a vent hole in the IHS is omitted, and the number of particles inside the volume remains constant. So, as this area heats up, the molecules bounce around faster and faster, exerting a greater and greater force on the volume's barrier. And the weakest point of this barrier is right here. I know you can't see that from back there, but it's right here, where the epoxy bonds to both the substrate and heat spreader. What we would expect to happen then, as Intel claims, is the epoxy to warp and deform under load, resulting in an uneven displacement and potentially severed connection between the CPU die, which is this shiny thing right here, and the IHS. If something like this were to happen, the purpose of the spreader would be null and void, and core temps under load would take the Space Shuttle Atlantis to the sun. This is a big no-no, obviously, so Intel improvised with the tiny hole. And this is particularly important in larger SKUs where this pocket of gas is expected to expand more rapidly during intensive workloads, which is why you see them on X series chips like this. By the way, in case you're wondering, through Fourier's law, it's gonna get a bit dicey here, but bear with me, the area of heat transfer scales linearly. So this small cutout in the IHS is proportional to the net conductive heat transfer loss through the material. This calculation is also dependent on the type of metal used, since the equation is also a function of thermal conductivity values, which are element dependent, and that is why it was important to use both nickel and copper for the IHS. So by Intel including this small hole for epoxy ventilation early in the CPU's life cycle, they've only reduced the efficiency of this heat transfer by around 1% or less, depending on its size. And in the case of this 10980XE, I'd say 1% is a very liberal estimate. So there you have it, a brief explanation along with a bit of math to validate the train of thought. Look, Intel knew what they were doing, obviously. They knew that the small vent wouldn't change the effectiveness of the IHS as a whole by any significant amount, and in their eyes was a worthy trade-off for ensuring proper epoxy curing in the production and testing phases. If you guys enjoyed this video, consider giving it a thumbs up, I would appreciate that. Consider subscribing, and I'll catch you in the next one. My name is Greg. Thanks for learning with me. Subscribe. That's so cringy.